Good morning and welcome to the February 2022 Wild Science webinar. Thanks everybody for jumping on to hear about some of the work our colleagues are doing. We're going to hear from Andrew Young from Fisheries, as well as Corey Gray from our research division today. I believe Andrew is going to kick things off for us. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. Remember, if you will, please keep your microphone muted unless you're asking a question. Presenters will go about 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions. You can also type your questions into the comments box, and I'll be glad to read those at the conclusion of each presenter's presentation today. So again, good morning. Let's get started with Andrew Young. Andrew will be speaking about the potential effects of live imaging sonar on crappie harvest. This is a little bit of a redux from a presentation he did for commissioners a few months back. Andrew is most recently our District 6 fisheries supervisor out of the Camden office, but is making the transition to fisheries management biologist in District 8. Andrew earned both his bachelor's and master's degrees at Southern Illinois University and held various part-time positions as an undergrad with Missouri DOC, Illinois Natural History Survey, as well as the Indiana Department of Natural Resources, and then came to Game and Fish almost exactly 8 years ago, and has been working in fisheries ever since. Andrew, looking forward to hearing this presentation. Take it away.
All right, thanks, man. We'll jump right into it. While I'm pulling this up, maybe if it'll let me. One thing that we forgot to mention, I'm also a crappie enthusiast. It's definitely something that is a major passion of mine, and these live imaging sonar discussions have been going on pretty often and sometimes pretty heated. So it's certainly something that we wanted to look at as an agency and see what's going on. So with that, I'll jump into it here. Just start out with, what is live imaging sonar? It's a gear used by recreational anglers to identify structure, fish, things like that, as you know, any sonar is. What's unique about live imaging sonar is that these previous versions of sonar types, whether that's a true depth finder that's just bouncing a wave down and coming back to give you a depth reading, the down looking sonar, the side looking sonars, those are all historical images of what was under the boat, or in the case of side looking sonar, what's beside the boat in a certain distance. But those are all historical. There's a little bit of a delay. The really cool thing with this new live imaging sonar, or forward-facing sonar, as the name indicates, it is a almost nearly real-time image of what's out in front of you. You don't have to drive over the top of these fish or over the structure itself to see what's down there. You can look out in front of you and back off some of those areas. The examples that are on the market at the moment are, of course, the Garmin LiveScope, Lowrance Active Target, and Hummingbird's Mega Live Imaging. So this is kind of the picture that started it all. This is the Garmin LiveScope. I believe this is one of the first images they released. You can see on this picture a pretty well-defined tree with fish swimming around it. And you can actually watch those fish move in real time. As you're kind of looking at this, in the upper corner near the depth marker, that is actually where the transducer is on the boat, looking away from the boat. So this is a tree and some structure down and out in front of the boat itself. This technology was available in late 2018. Then in 2020, I believe it was in the fall of 2020, the Lowrance came out with their version, which is the Active Target. What I really like about this picture is you can see some of these fish here, and you can actually see some fins. You can see a tail fin. You can see some swimming action going on there. really detailed view of what's going on under the water. And then, of course, one of the other major players, Humminbird, came out with their version, which is the Mega Live Imaging. It just came out last fall, so late 2021. They released their version. This version, this view, you may say, wait a second, that doesn't look like it's looking out in front of the boat. It's not. You can turn these transducers to face down as well. So if you're over the top of, in this case, you're looking at 30 to 35 feet of water, you can kind of look down and watch those fish as well. This is the really cool thing. That's actually bait bouncing up and down in front of a fish. It allows you to kind of see real-time reactions. If you slow the bait down, does the fish back off? Does it become more aggressive? If you speed it up, in this case, you see them kind of pulling it away. You can actually see what's going on with the fish. Are they turning sideways and ignoring it? Are they coming after it? Are they chasing? It's a really cool view. I always kind of joke that the only way it's going to get better is if you stick your head underwater. So it's a very good tool to use. So, of course, as an agency, we needed to evaluate what was going on with this technology and seeing if there were any potential issues, whether that be overharvest, selected harvest, whatever. It's our job to look into this stuff and do it in a scientifically defensible manner. So why are we worried about crappie specifically? Well, this technology really took off in the crappie industry. Crappie anglers tend to be more harvest oriented than those targeting, say black bass, where catch and release is kind of king amongst those anglers. Our crappie anglers like to eat. I'm a crappie angler myself, and I tend to joke I might be one of the only catch and release crappie anglers around. But I also like to take a few home and have some fish tacos or something when I get back to the house. So if there was going to be, an issue with some overharvest, crappie would be one of the places it would show up first. They're also the second most popular species in the state of Arkansas amongst our resident anglers. Our 2016 angler survey, they were number 2 as the top choice of fish being targeted, right behind black bass and just ahead of trout. So we have a lot of folks that are out there pursuing these fish. It's become really popular. The perceived effectiveness, crappie tend to school. So if you can find them and get them to react, there's a lot of them there. There's a potential for the action to be very fast. There's also potential for the action to be very slow because they tend to be pretty finicky. I always joke, if the wind changes direction or slows down a half mile an hour, you got to figure out something else to do for crappie. And this live imaging sonar allows anglers to see those reactions in real time. So, of course, we had to conduct some research here. So it just so happened that we were already doing creel surveys where we set up, in this case, at a boat ramp and interview folks as they come off the water about their completed fishing trips. 9 out of our 10 districts across the state were already doing these creel surveys. And we worked with our human dimensions coordinator on a question that didn't want to bias responses one way or another. And essentially, we just asked people, do you have live scope? Do you not? We interviewed nearly 700 parties of crappie anglers. So over 1,000 people were included in this that were specifically fishing for crappie. And just over a third of those parties had live imaging sonar. So we definitely saw quite a few of them out there and talked to a lot of folks using them. So what were we wanting to get from this? We often hear a lot of concern about live imaging anglers are catching way more fish than anybody else. They're only taking 2 to 3 pounders. They're cropping off the really large fish, and that they're harvesting a lot more of them. They're catching more, they're bigger, they're taking them out more. So, of course, we investigated this through our creel surveys. So the first question we'll talk about is, do live imaging anglers catch more crappie? In this case, they did. It was about twice as many. You can see The average live imaging angler caught almost 2.5 crappie per hour per person. The folks without it were just over 1 crappie per person per hour. So they were catching them about twice as fast. So then we were looking at size. Were these live imaging anglers catching larger crappie than anglers without it? So we looked at this 2 ways. We looked at it with weight and we looked at it with length. And they were essentially the exact same fish. The differences we're talking in weight here are about 2 ounces. And actually the non-live imaging anglers harvested fish that were slightly heavier. But the live imaging anglers harvested fish that were slightly longer. And when I say slightly, I'm talking 1/4 of an inch. So statistically speaking, they're harvesting the same fish. They're not only taking larger fish, they're not taking smaller fish. It ends up being about the same on a statewide basis. So then we were looking at, do these live imaging anglers harvest more crappie than folks without it? We already knew they were catching more. Are they harvesting more? So one of the ways we were looking at this was to say, what percentage of the crappie that are caught during a fishing trip were harvested? So of course, as everybody knows, you throw some fish back, if they're too small or whatever, you're not keeping fish that day. But if you harvest some, there's a percentage of that. And so what we're looking at here is about 42% of the crappie that were caught by live imaging anglers were harvested, but about 64% of the crappie caught by non-live imaging anglers were harvested. So if you look at that, you're going to say, man, those folks without the live imaging were keeping fish at a rate that's about 1.5 times higher. But we also have to remember they were catching them half as fast. So it's really not as large of a discrepancy as we think on fish being taken home. So one of the ways to look at that is limits. You always hear limits of crappie. We caught, whether that's 30, whether that's 15, whatever, you often hear about, they're just hauling limit after limit out of these lakes. Of those 700 parties that we interviewed, we saw 16 limits. That's about 2.5% of all the anglers we talked to took home a limit. So it's a really small sample size. And so you're going to look at this and you're going to say, man, the folks with live imaging, that 4.5% of those anglers harvested a limit when, 1.2% of our folks without live imaging sonar harvested a limit. But in reality, these numbers could be swung by just 1 or 2 limits. If you see the standard error, which is in parentheses here, on that 4.6, that's a pretty large standard error. So there's a bit of variance there. So I will also add, of those 16 limits, 7 of them came from the same lake. So this kind of makes an argument for a case-by-case basis on what's happening. If we hadn't have had that one lake included in the survey, and it's a well-known crappie lake in the area. So it's definitely one that has a lot of harvest already. And so we'll just have to continue to keep an eye on that, especially on that lake. The other thing I'll add, of these 16 limits that were harvested across the state, nearly 40% of them were illegal limits. So whether that was a 30 fish limit, which was on some of our lakes, and they came out with 40, or a 15 fish limit and they came out with 17 or 20 or 25, or they had just too many, and we covered essentially any regulation that's in place in Arkansas was included in this survey. We had lakes without a limit, we had lakes with 30 fish limit, lakes with 15 fish limit, lake with 10-inch minimum length limits, you name it. So that was a little concerning and certainly unexpected. So to kind of wrap up all this information I just threw at you, I know there were a lot of raw numbers there. So what we saw was roughly 1/3 of our anglers that were targeting crappie are using live imaging sonar. I think a lot of this is due to the perceived effectiveness and popularity of what you're getting from it. Our live imaging anglers caught about twice as many fish per hour, but our folks without live imaging sonar were harvesting at a higher rate of what they were catching. There was no difference, at least on a statewide level, in the length or weight of the fish harvested. It doesn't appear that the fish being harvested are, larger, smaller, whatever. And our live imaging anglers did harvest a few more limits, but again, only 2.5% of all crappie parties interviewed had a limit. So there's still a lot of wiggle room there. So where are we going from there? We did this and looked at it and saw our results, but science never sleeps. So where do we go from here? We're not looking to regulate live scope or live imaging sonar. We don't intend to regulate that gear. If we see on a particular lake that there is an issue with it, we can move forward manipulating harvest or adjusting harvest one way or another, whether that's a size limit of some kind or a creel limit adjustment. And then that falls into my next bullet point of population modeling. If a higher percent of anglers are catching limits, does that matter? In Arkansas, the mortality rate or how many fish die on an annual basis is about 65% on average. So, I always tell folks for easy numbers, if you start with 100 fish, you're down to about 3 in about 4 years or so. So the turnover is very quickly. Therefore, if we do see an issue and we feel the need to implement some regulations, the rebound is going to be pretty quick because these populations turn over so fast. Again, what happens if these large fish are being removed from the system? We didn't really see that in our surveys on a statewide level. Maybe on a lake by lake basis, there is some of that going on. We're working on some population modeling for that to see what happens. What happens if you crop off these really old fish? There may not be a whole lot of change. There may be a large change. So there's always a next step, and that's definitely one of the ones we're exploring at this time. And then, of course, we're always working on exploitation studies. Again, that kind of comes back to our individual lake basis. Harvest rates change throughout the state. Having worked in South Central Arkansas, we have some really high harvest rates on things like bass that they just don't see in say the north central part of the state. So we know harvest rates change across the state, and so that's definitely something to keep an eye on. And so finally, I'll give a shout out to my crappie folks. I'm chair of the crappie team, and these are all my folks that help out on a statewide basis, and I'm gonna throw it to them. So with that, I'll take any questions from anybody.
All right, thanks, Andy. I know that I believe Randy Zellers from Communications is on here. I got a note from him that he had a question. Randy, do you want to throw that out?
Sure. My question is, during the surveys, were there any questions asked of the anglers as far as registering their level of experience or their avidity with crappie angling? Because these are expensive units, and so if I spend that much, I better use it a lot more. So were there anything like that asked?
Sort of. So there is a question, at least I can vouch for the district I was supervising at the time. We actually asked how many days a year do you fish? And then we actually asked how many days a year do you fish on this particular water body during this time period. And I can tell you, at least in our survey, there was really no difference. I was kind of shocked. And as far as avidity, I would have assumed that the more avid anglers were going to do better. Now, I can tell you the lake that I was covering, that was the lake that had the 7 out of the 16 limits. And a few of those limits were guides. So I assume those guys are good at what they're doing, since they do it for a living. So that may have weighed in some, and it's probably something we'll have to dig into on a case by case basis, because a really avid angler on Lake Charles may not be considered a really avid angler on Norfolk. Um, we just don't know that, and maybe it's the other way around. So that's certainly something to dig into, and this is still some preliminary work. We're going to dig into it further, but yeah, that's a great question. And I tell people, if you gave me the best driver and the best golf ball ever made, I'm still going to stink at golf. You give it to a tour pro, they're going to pick up 20, 30 yards on their drive every time. So there is a learning curve with this. A lot of the guys I talk to are like, man, I just went out and used it for a week and didn't even fish. Just ran it and tried to learn it. I think there's a lot of folks watching videos, trying to figure out how to use this stuff before they go out, because it's not. I don't think it's necessarily something you just turn on and instantly pick it up and can do it.
All right, thanks.
One more question, Andrew. Looks like David Graves has one here. Are older fish more productive in terms of reproduction than younger fish? And then there's a follow-up. I asked because some wildlife species are more productive in the younger stages of their life. So would the removal of larger, older fish hurt the reproduction in a particular lake, or would it stay about the same?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I was kind of leading to that a little bit in my discussion about harvesting these larger fish. In a lot of species of fish, the really old fish, when you're talking a 2.5, 3 pound crappie, that's a really old fish. I always tell folks, number one, statistically speaking, that fish is already dead. It on a statistical standpoint, it should not have lived that long anyways. It's already had an above average life. You figure it's contributed multiple times over the years. Its genes are well spread. And in a lot of fish species, yes, older fish are less productive. And so really, you catch a 3 pounder in November, the odds of that fish ever making it to spawn anyways are slim to none. And it's already contributed multiple times, and it's likely not contributing as well as its 10-inch counterparts.
All right. Any further questions for Andy before we move on to Corey Gray from the research division? Anybody else got anything? All right, Andy, great job, man. Fascinating topic that I hear a lot about in my various media appearances. I know a lot of people have their finger on the pulse of this, and glad to know that you and others in our staff are keeping tabs on what's going on and just trying to understand this a little bit better.
Yep. Thanks, Trey.
Thanks, Andy. All right, let's move on. Next up is Corey Gray, whose presentation will be on the North American model of wildlife management, something we hear a lot about at Arkansas Game and Fish and throughout our travels. For those that don't know Corey, he's been with the Game and Fish Commission for 22 years, graduated from Arkansas State in 1997 with a Bachelor of Science in Wildlife Conservation and Ecology, and he has held various positions in his 22 years. He's taken him from a private lands biologist down in southeast Arkansas. He was elk biologist for a while up in the Ozarks, and also was our whitetail deer program coordinator for a few years, and now leads the professionals as chief of our agency's research division. Corey has been fortunate to be awarded the Wildlife Management Division's Biologist of the Year Award in 2008 and also the Campbell Award in 2018. He's a certified wildlife biologist through the Wildlife Society and a certified Boone and Crockett measurer, as well as an alumni of the National Conservation Leadership Institute. And Corey asked me to also add that he's a pretty all right guy. Corey, take it away, man.
All right, thanks, Trey Reed. Let's see here.
We
All right,
got
good
you.
morning, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity. My presentation will be just a little bit different than what we typically have in these events, in that we have our wildlife and fisheries professionals presenting data that they've collected or a project that they have completed. This presentation is just a little bit more of an overview of the model, where science fits into it, and then I will conclude with some challenges. So this is a kind of just a brief outline of what we'll go through. Again, just covering the main pillars of the model, the role of science. I'll kind of camp out there just a tad, and then conclude with present and future challenges that affect this model. So as you look at this, as you define the model, this publication called it a set of principles that collectively applied, so if you put them all together, has led to the form, function, and success of wildlife conservation in the United States. I typically view them as foundational. So again, one is not standalone of the others. Here they are. There's 7 pillars. You'll hear them called as 7 principles. They call a wide range of terms, but the first one is that wildlife resources is a public trust. Markets for game are eliminated. Allocation of wildlife should be by law. Wildlife can be killed for only legitimate purposes. Wildlife considered an international resource. Science is a proper tool to discharge wildlife policy. And then lastly, the democracy of hunting as standard. So I'll kind of, again, quickly go through each one of these uniquely. But as you look at it as wildlife as a public trust, this publication said that it's the keystone of all pillars, that the concept that wildlife is owned by no one. It's held in trust for the benefit of the present and future generations, that wildlife is just so valuable that not one single individual could own it, that it's owned by all of them. And when you go back and you look at the history of this, I thought it was interesting that Roman law in AD 529 said that by law of nature, these things are common to all mankind: the air, running water, sea, and consequently the shore of the sea. No one, therefore, is forbidden to approach the seashore. So I thought that was a very interesting quote, going all the way back to AD 529. Markets for game are eliminated. We understand that in the 19th century, market hunting, the unregulated take of meat and hides did lead to extreme population declines. And you're actually privatizing common resources. So, you're taking an animal that's in the public trust and you're making it private for financial gain. There is an exception for fur bearers, but fur bearers, that is a tool. It's highly regulated and it serves as a conservation purpose. Allocation of wildlife is by law. Wildlife is allocated to the public by law. It's not based off of market hunting, land ownership, or any other status. We have a democratic process with public input. And when you explore this a little bit, I thought it was kind of interesting. Most of these regulations, especially the historical ones, were based off of personal safety or protection of livestock. But I was able to find one of the first regulations that were recorded in the United States was the Massachusetts Bay Colony, 1630. There's a reward for killing a wolf. 1646, I thought this was interesting, again, just from a deer standpoint. Their deer season was from May the 1st to November the 1st. So I guess you shoot them in the spring and the summertime. And then, again, they tried to establish this based off of some sort of harvest restrictions and then also fair chase standards. Killing can only be for a legitimate purpose. It's defined as for food, fur, self-defense, and protection of property. Again, trying to maintain this mixture of fair chase, put aside the financial gain, and then also trying to emphasize a clean harvest to minimize suffering and wanton waste. It's an international resource. We understand that the management of another country, or maybe the lack of management from another country, could have impact on migratory species. The Migratory Bird Treaty Convention of 1916 is probably one of the greatest milestones in the history of wildlife conservation. And so it was just a huge tool in the toolbox that allowed us to manage these species as they cross international lines. Democracy of hunting. Theodore Roosevelt and Aldo Leopold both envisioned a nation where all citizens had the opportunity to engage in conservation and hunting. That the hunting was not restricted to those with special status, wealth, or privilege, but for all citizens in good standing. And then lastly, I want to kind of talk a little bit more about the science as a proper tool to discharge wildlife. So Aldo Leopold, in his game management book in 1933, defined a Roosevelt doctrine of conservation. And it recognized that all outdoor resources as one integral whole, and that these conservation through wise use was a public responsibility and a public trust responsibility. And then finally, it recognized science as a tool for discharging this responsibility. So it was the foundation for informed decision making, in that data available to be long-term monitoring of populations, and then also understanding that research would be necessary, that to explore and to answer unanswered questions. So I tried to develop this diagram here of the typical process that you would go through in changing or implementing some science-based policy. So you would have this problem, a decision, or a need that the population was needing, some sort of action that needed to be applied. So you can conduct a literature review, see what information is out there, see what other states have done, see what the research says. In those cases where there's a void in data that maybe you need to collect your own research to try to fill that void, and then you would develop a management recommendation based off the data and the information that was gathered, seek policy or regulation change, and then develop a management plan, implement the plan, and collect data and evaluate the plan. But we understand that there's limitations to science-based management. Of course, funding is always a limitation. There's time. It takes time to answer some questions. A lot of many cases where data is absent, and we realize that in wildlife conservation that you will not have all the answers. That there will be data voids out there, and then of course you have outside influences. And I had to put in people, and I like that the illustration of a three-legged stool, where you have the habitat component, you have the wildlife component, and then you have the people component. But in these data voids, what's the best way to go? And so I really appreciate this quote by Theodore Roosevelt. It says, any moment of decision, the best thing you can do is the right thing. The next best thing is the wrong thing. And the worst thing you can do is nothing. So we've heard in the past where some say that if there's a void in data, you just sit still till that void is filled. So if there's a void in science, there's a void in knowledge, then you do nothing. Well, we understand that science, wildlife management is a science, but it's also an art. So that conservation is science-based, but it's also evidence-based, and that there are times that we need to act, that we cannot wait on trying to fill voids, but you take all your information together and then create, go with evidence, and then you go move forward with an art of wildlife conservation. So I want to highlight people very quickly. I want to go back to the three-legged stool. Again, we understand the animal side of this, we understand the habitat side of this, but I want to just spend just a couple of moments here talking about the third leg of this, and that's the people side. And I really appreciate this quote again by Aldo Leopold. He said there's two anomalies in the modern ecology, that these two groups seem basically unaware of the existence of the other. One is the human community, that is, it's a separate entity. The other one is a plant and animal community. And then it doesn't get into the politics of the liberal arts, but this inevitable fusion of these two lines of thought will perhaps constitute the outstanding advance in this century. So when you look at that third leg, that's where the role of social science comes in. It understands public desires. It identifies where public resistance may occur. It provides a baseline of people's understanding regarding specific issues. It can track trends in public opinion over time. And it strengthens that three-legged stool, that without that, the stool would be very unstable. So now I want to kind of get into the next and the final component of this, is the present and future challenges of the model. So moving forward, what does this model, can it withstand the time and the other challenges that come into it? And the following slides are just a list of things that came to my mind as challenges that's always attacking the model. So the first one is just the continued evolution of wildlife management and human demographics. So you have this transition that's taking place from a less from a traditional point of view, more to a mutualist or even a pluralist point of view, and how people view wildlife, how they interact with wildlife, increasing wildlife populations and conflicts with humans, that we have now a diminishing value of certain species. They actually become vermin. So, you place a white-tailed deer out in the county and it's cherished as a resource that'll be hunted, but you place it in the city limits and it's an animal that you want to get rid of all of a sudden, and it's causing a lot of harm. Declining hunting numbers. How do we continue to fund conservation? That's one of the things about this model, is this self-paced system through that we manage wildlife through. But as hunters decline, can we continue to manage the species? And then management of game species. We understand that without hunters, how do you manage a continually growing population? And then decreasing wildlife species in sensitive habitats. There's a competition for limiting resources. Continued challenges is when the majority of the habitat is on private lands, but wildlife is considered a public resource. Can this promote a mine mentality where a majority of Arkansas is privately owned? But again, the wildlife considered a public resource, and so you get the the animals on my property, so therefore I own it. Communication of sound wildlife principles. How do we actually communicate what we do? We understand there's all sorts of forms of communication out there, but how many of them are actually resonating with our hunters? One of the things that I've always heard is that not every missile hits, and that an unobserved missile is a wasted missile. So we fire a lot of missiles, but how many of them are actually hitting the entire target? And then lack of acceptance of science, the doubting of science. We see that today, that there's always someone out there that's going to sell a better oil, a snake oil salesman, and that science sometimes just doesn't taste very well, that medicine doesn't go down very well, and that there's always another product out there that tastes better and that people will be more attractive to that. Increase of privatization of wildlife, commercialization of wildlife, captive cervids, the illegal wildlife trade. Again, it goes back to the public trust. The increased gadgetry and change of fair chase perception. I put on here, take a trip to Walmart. You can walk down any hunting section of any store and you'll see gadgets and just this increase of gadgetry and how it's pushing the fair chase envelope. Unreasonable hunter expectations. There's bag limit competitions, and it's not only about getting your bag limit, but maybe it's the time at which you get the bag limit is now the competition. Disease threats, we understand CWD, white nose syndrome are always pushing the envelope. Habitat loss, urban sprawl, development, policy changes, the need for energy, and I placed in here Northwest Arkansas. You can see that's part of our state that's growing rapidly. It's displacing wildlife. And so in the future, how will people and wildlife intermingle up there? And what changes will need to happen? Over-regulating. Are game laws too burdensome? I looked at our Game and Fish Code of Regulations, and it's 513 pages. So I know that our agency is very active in trying to reduce regulations. This is something of great emphasis to us, but it's something we should be mindful of. And then finally, invasive species, competing for resources. And there's a wide range of invasive species that we could go down. The first one that comes to my mind are feral hogs, where they're out there actively competing against resources, food, habitat of our game animals. And then this is be my final slide, just the overall lack of awareness. Many wildlife professionals today are not familiar with the principles of the North American model. And then I believe even more of our hunters are unaware of the model. So again, how do we communicate these founding principles that go into our profession? And that's all I have.
All right. right. Does anybody have any questions for Corey related to his presentation on the North American model of wildlife management? Corey, one comes to mind, and you sort of addressed this with some of the challenges, but we talk about the North American model all the time, within the agency at least, and maybe there's not an awareness among the general public as much. But I mean, where does it maybe fall short? I mean, where are some deficiencies maybe presently in the way we approach the model?
Yeah, Trey, I think there's several avenues there that it does fall short. I mean, there's actually some publications that list and detail each avenue where the model falls short. But, the one that just immediately comes to my mind is it's so game species oriented that it really doesn't impact a lot of the non-game species. So, as the model evolves and does it need to be evolving and in order to keep up, but going future, then should it be broadened out to include more of our non-game wildlife species?
Well, you got an amen from Allie Fowler on that.
Good. That means a lot coming from her. Good.
Hey, Corey, this is Roger. Quick question, and I had to step out. I might have missed some of this, but what do you think are the biggest threats to the model over the next 10 years?
Yeah, we listed off several there, but I think just the continuing push of, I think it's coming at different angles to it. I think we're constantly being pushed about the public trust. I think we're being pushed about fair chase, are just two that immediately came to my mind. The one that probably speaks the heaviest to me is the public trust that, I love the idea that wildlife is just so valuable that one individual cannot hold it, cannot possess it, that it belongs to all of us. And we see how that's eroding away, either through, high fences, through just the illegal trade of wildlife, where you're now taking private ownership of something that was public and trying to benefit yourself.
Thanks, Corey. I appreciate it. I tell you what, I've been lucky to work at other places in the world. Spent some time in Africa, and the system they have there is not functioning. So that's a perfect example of the slippery slope you run into.
Yep.
Corey, what can we do as an agency, or maybe even a bigger sense as managers and people who talk about management? What do we do to make sure? You talked about the erosion of trust in science. We're seeing that a lot with other things going on in the world right now. What can we do to ensure that we hold on to the public trust here in Arkansas specifically, in what we do and how we manage wildlife in the context of the North American model?
Yeah. I do think our trust sometimes is eroding, and that's something that we've visited with our social scientists about, is how do we get the trust back in with our agency, or that we become the dominant voice when we're talking about science-based management, that the voice is not social media, it's not YouTube, it's not the hunting channel, but it's the state wildlife agency. And again, not every message is palatable. Not everything that we say is well received. I would rather not go down that path. And so many hunters just say, I would rather have something that's sweeter to absorb, and so I'll go this way. But also think about how our communication has changed so much with our hunters and how they want information back. It may be public meetings is not the future of how we communicate to our hunters. Maybe that it's some other form of video, it's some other form of communication, and that's how they want to receive their information.
All right. See, I thought I saw maybe one in the comments from Dennis. Dennis Thunderdale asked, are we still allowing captive wildlife permits in Arkansas?
Yeah, not for cervids, we're not. Those that did own cervids are now grandfathered in. I can't speak of other species, But for cervids, I do know that our commission has a moratorium on those.
Okay, anybody else? All right, hearing no other questions or seeing no other questions, we'll wrap this thing up. Corey, thank you very much. And Andy Young, thank you as well. A couple of great presentations, and thank you to all of our colleagues for taking a little bit of time on a cold February morning to learn more about some of the work that our folks here at the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission are doing. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you in March for the next iteration of the Wild Science webinar. Take care, everybody.